I teach a class that brings me into contact with people from all different backgrounds and cultures. In the last 10 years, I have taught accountants, barbers, chefs, car mechanics, loan officers, musicians, tattoo artists, a refrigerator repairman, poets, preachers, teachers, even somebody who used to play Goofy at Disneyland. One of my students is a man called Charles. Charles is a 60-something African-American man, extremely shy with a stammer, a kind man who life has not been very easy to. Charles took my class because he thought it might help him overcome some of his obstacles. And in doing the class, it meant Charles had to be part of a big group, which was very difficult for him. In fact, in his own words, he said, "It's not who I am, but I did it. I surprised myself. I got to express myself, and I was able to communicate and articulate. It gave me courage. It was a whole new beginning." And some of the other students started to see the changes in Charles too. One of them said, "I met Charles prior to these classes. I love seeing that change as a brother, to see him snap out of it and take responsibility and accountability, the true definition of a man." One thing everybody I teach have in common is that they are or were all incarcerated when I taught them. Charles was down for 40 years for first-degree murder and robbery. So I'd just like you to take a second and self-reflect. Has that information changed anything about how you view Charles? Do you see him with less sympathy now? If you do, it's a natural human reaction to finding out that somebody is incarcerated for murder. But Charles committed his crime over 40 years ago, and he served 40 years in prison for it. Who in this room who's lived more than 40 years is the same now as they were then, or even 10 years? And that might be without doing too much to better yourself. So when does Charles get to stop being a violent criminal? When he's done his time? Never? If we do choose never, that means we have to admit that corrections does not correct, or humans are unredeemable, in which case we can forget about religion or compassion. In America today, we incarcerate more of our people than any other country in the world. And that includes Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Just throwing up our hands and punishing people has never worked. Never. Because if it did, America would be #1 in rehabilitation. And as it stands today, we're #1 in incarceration. And even if we emptied out every federal prison today, we'd still be the most over-incarcerated country in the world, because these issues happen at a state level. We try juvenile offenders as adults, and we give them life sentences, even though it's proven by science that juvenile brains are different than adult brains. We lock people up in solitary confinement, even though it's proven to damage them more. We incarcerate people who need treatment. We believe the hype, and we remove people from society that we're scared of. We ignore trauma, data, and science because we want to be able to feel like we did something to address the issues of crime. Of youth who've never been incarcerated before, African American youth are 6 times more likely than their white counterparts to be incarcerated for identical crimes. We have failed. And in that failure, we have done untold damage to millions of people, our communities, and ourselves. The class I teach is the Actors Gang Prison Project. It's a program that grew out of the Actors Gang Theatre Company in Los Angeles, a theatre company that was founded by the actor-director Tim Robbins over 35 years ago to bring entertaining theatre that addresses the issues our communities are dealing with. The work that we do is based on commedia dell'arte, which is a 600-year-old form of European theatre that is highly emotional and physical. And we've been able to use this approach to harness truth and to transform emotions to be able to create value. So when we started this work 10 years ago, the issues of mass incarceration and the rise of the punishment over rehabilitation paradigm were invisible. There were no daily stories on NPR. There was no push for legislative change. There was no criminal justice reform movement. And there was definitely no funding. But today, there's a growing movement of people who are trying to address the underlying issues and redress the damage that we've caused. These people are activists, foundations, politicians, cops, artists, scientists, and especially incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. One of the things that I've noticed that could derail my efforts for criminal justice reform is the habit of using language that we've heard bandied about but have never actually addressed and have never actually asked questions about. So in the last year, I've started to ask questions. And what I've discovered is that the answers are either incomplete or tend to be very confusing. And we have to address this, because if we don't, the next generation are going to be fighting these same battles all over again. A good example is the word recidivism. The dictionary definition of recidivism is a tendency to relapse into a previous condition or mode of behavior, especially relapse into criminal behavior. So California is a very good example of how a word like recidivism that is constantly bandied about actually doesn't have an overall definition. And in California, our legislature and our governor's office have been in discussion with our Department of Justice to try to come up with a joint definition of recidivism across the board. But the governor's office wants to only include people who are returned to prison. The Department of Justice and law enforcement want to include all formal charges and convictions, even if they are not returned to prison. It's worth noting that with that definition comes harsher sentencing and more access to funding. It's also worth noting that the way we count recidivism now, we count somebody who commits murder the same as somebody who crosses state lines to go to a funeral when they're on parole. And it's impossible if we don't really have an overarching understanding of what recidivism means. How can we measure it? And is it really recidivism we care about? Really? Okay. If you say you care about recidivism, check this out. People who commit murder are the least likely to recidivate. Less than 1% of them do. So in California, in a 20-year span, 988 people convicted of murder were released. 1% of them were convicted of new crimes, none were convicted of murder, and none went back to prison. So, the answer is not to be tough on crime. In California, in the last 25 years, we've added 1,000 laws to our penal code, which means if you commit a crime today, you will probably get 51% more time than if you committed the exact same crime 20 years ago. So maybe now we can see we might not be as clear about recidivism as we thought we were. What about violent crime? That's got to be straightforward, right? You would hope so. So we always hear about non-violent drug offenders who should be released and violent offenders who should be locked up and throw away the key, right? It's interesting because the Department of Justice just released a report that shows only 16% of our incarcerated people are there for non-violent drug offenses. 53% are there for violent offenses. So what actually constitutes a violent crime? Well, interestingly, often violent crimes come about as the result of drug addiction, possession, or sales. For instance, if you are somebody who's dealing with drug addiction and you break into an empty garage to steal some tools to sell for your drug addiction, in a lot of states that's considered first-degree burglary, which is considered a violent crime. If you commit a street robbery unarmed, but you push somebody, that also can be considered a violent crime. If a group of kids steal an iPhone from another kid, that in New York will be considered possible armed robbery because of the threat of violence and the value of the phone. So you can see that actually violent crime is a legal term that for ordinary people like us covers a bunch of events that we probably wouldn't actually consider violent as we know it. And yet, 98% of rapists will never spend a single day in prison or jail. So, when you've been arrested, your next port of call is the plea deal. Plea deals, as we know from the movies, are when the badass prosecutor sits across from the downtrodden bad guy and makes him an offer he can't refuse, right? But in real life, they are much higher stakes. In 2013, 97% of cases were resolved through plea deals. Only 3% went to trial. And what that means is in America today, of the 2.2 million people who are incarcerated, 2 million are there as a result of plea deals. The National Registry of Exonerations estimates that 10% of exonerations are the result of false plea deals. So, what about a very difficult word to talk about, and that is victim? And in no way do I wish to lessen the experience of victims of crime. In fact, I am one. But we have to admit, when we talk about victim and perpetrator, that the lines are blurred at least. When I work in prisons, it's rare that I come into contact with somebody I work with or somebody I know who is not also a victim of crime. And while it's very difficult, we are going to have to sit in the ambiguity of the blurred lines between victim and perpetrator. We know from the Stanford prison experiment, a famous experiment, what trauma incarceration can cause. But what about the trauma people experience before they commit crimes, or might be partly responsible for why they commit crimes? 92.5% of youth offenders have experienced trauma. And in the adult community, a study was done on 150 female inmates, and what was found was that 70% of them had experienced extreme violence from their childhood caregiver or parent. So victim and perpetrator, unfortunately, have very blurred lines. And now we're talking about language. When people come back from prison and re-enter our communities, the divide is huge and made bigger by our own assumptions and fears. If you spend years in prison being referred to as inmate, prisoner, crook, criminal, convict, thug, gangster, and then when you come out, we just put X in front of it. We keep people imprisoned. Who here has done something they're ashamed of, thinks they'd be able to get over it if they were constantly referred to as the ex-bully, the ex-school failure, the ex-broken heart? We call our students students for a reason, and it's not semantics. With that small word, we give them some of their humanity back and cause them to strive. And also, we are not constantly identifying them with their worst day. And language is important. If you're part of a movement like I am, the criminal justice reform movement, it's very easy when you're pushing up against these massive issues to externalize and to forget that whether consciously or unconsciously, we are all culpable for where our system is today. If we care about victims and want to ensure there aren't more, if we care about public safety or fiscal responsibility, we're going to have to make different choices. And even if you feel like you're not part of this movement or it has nothing to do with you, it behooves us as a nation to ensure that the huge amounts of money, time, and effort spent are spent in ways that create value, not just conveniently removing people and then dealing with the effects of it for generations to come. So, in the words of the poet Delbert Tibbs, a man who was exonerated of murder from death row, this is the place for thoughts that do not end in concreteness. It is necessary to be curious and dangerous to dwell here, to wonder why and how and when is dangerous. But that's how we get out of this hole. So remember Charles? I could tell you a story about Charles that's very common among our former students, of big success in education, getting a great job, having a happy relationship for the first time in their lives, or giving back to the community to make sure other people don't tread the well-worn path between school to prison. But for Charles, what this work did for him, it enabled him at an advanced age to reveal his full potential. And for all humans, isn't that the greatest success? In Charles's own words, "For a long time, I was hiding from me. And now I feel like I can look at myself and love who I am. I was so selfish not sharing myself with others. This class has done so much for me. I can't even express how I feel. I want to cry. I feel like I can be the real me in here. I was lost. Now I am found, and I can see. So when I had the idea for the Prison Project 10 years ago, I was fresh off the boat, an actress just trying to find my way in LA. And when I heard about the incredible injustices of this system, I wanted to do something, but I had nothing to give, except for my understanding of the power of the arts to transform. So that's where I started. And for 4 years, we struggled as volunteers to build this program. And often, I didn't know how to overcome the massive obstacles we faced or how to lead, and often I still don't. But what I can say is in the last 10 years, everything I've learned has been from the people who have had the courage to do this difficult work, not because they want to be actors, but because they want to change something about themselves so they can affect their families and their communities. And so yes, I've learned courage, I've learned persistence, I've learned that in every human interaction is the potential for latent joy. And most of all, I've learned that every single human being has this incredible potential within them. And that on its own means that every one of us deserves respect and a second chance. Thank you.